Good afternoon, dear friends. Actually, this is rather a good evening, and today we start our final session for today of our online conference. It is called The Art of Justice, Dealing with Inequality in Cities. My name is Natalia Trunova. I'm Vice President, Head of Special Development Center for Strategic Research Foundation. Really, inequality is a global problem. We know that the World Bank has published new data on inequality, which will arise due to COVID-19, and 5% of households will see their incomes go down dramatically. 25% of jobs in cities, primarily in cities related to the industries most affected by the pandemic, such as catering, tourism, would become redundant. The lecture delivered by Edward Glaser also showed the transformations pertinent to the urban economy in the United States. And today we're going to speak about different territories. We have speakers from various countries. United Nations Habitat believes that territorial inequality is one of the key issues in Agenda 2030. Access to jobs, access to social services, to public transportation, certainly to housing, which has to be affordable. These are the top priorities for United Nations Habitat. We know that one of the national projects is aimed, one of the goals of the national projects is to alleviate poverty. We know that the problem has some territorial component in it. Let me introduce to you our speakers. First, I will start with those who are with us remotely. Graham Alabaster, Chief, United Nations Habitat Geneva Office. David Napier, Professor of Medical Anthropology, University College London. Guillermo Pinoslosa, Founder and Chair of 880 Cities, Ambassador, World Urban Parks. And with me is also Olga Vendina, leading researcher, Institute of Geography, Russian Academy of Sciences. Olga, my first question goes to you. You did a unique research dedicated to the inter-city inequality between different districts of Moscow, proceeding from different indicators. Can you tell us more about that research? What are the main conclusions, and how can we address inequality in such a megacity as Moscow? Thank you so much, Natalia, for this kind introduction. I will not deep dive into the research because its results have been published. As a researcher, I'd like to speak about the internal changes which are taking place in Moscow and dealing with Moscow primarily. As a researcher, I'm more interested not in the questions of socially vulnerable social strata, which is very important for the politicians or managers. I'm rather interested in the sources or causes of inequality which create this inequality of access, not only to the financial resources, but to diverse social opportunities, including the access to education, access to power, if I can put it like that, access to accumulated social and cultural capital or asset created by the family. So we're speaking about the diversity of the sources which inequality originate from. I'm a geographer by background, and therefore I'm very much interested in the special manifestation of inequality. First of all, segregation, neighborhoods, proximity, and interaction between different social groups. And the third question is again the question which we have asked: how can we react to the occurring changes? As we know, our policy is not proactive but rather reactive. Speaking about Moscow, we see a traditional controversy between egalitarianism and inequality, despite the fact that in terms of the property inequality, which is marked by Gini index, can be compared to Washington, London, Paris, the biggest global cities, but still, for Moscow, an egalitarian nature is very typical, meaning that we don't have slums, hoodlums, and in Moscow we don't have any ethnic ghettos or enclaves or some suburban banlieue, for instance, or areas which are populated mostly by certain ethnic groups, which is a distinguishing mark of Paris. For some time, and this was a legacy of the Soviet Union, we had a division of the society not by the property features, but rather by social and cultural features. For instance, the profession or the level of education were the distinguishing factors. These defined the city, and once we shifted to the market economy, it created a segregation which included not only the social and cultural diversification or stratification, but it caused other factors into being. This map is called a reputational pressure of the place because it takes into consideration certain factors. The life of the people, the size of the apartment, the price per square meter, the level of education, political preferences of the population, and also the beautifying of the urban territory. We see here that despite an equalizing of the urban environment and visiting certain city districts, you will not tell one from the other. Still, by these social parameters, you may see that there are differences. Sadly, we cannot but mention COVID-19 and its impact. COVID-19 has exacerbated the inequality which does exist in the urban area or environment. Next slide, please. Thank you so much. On that map, you see the difference in the behavior of people amid the pandemic depending on the property. The red color stands for reduction in the number of the people who, after lockdown was introduced, stayed at home. Prior to the pandemic, there would be many more people living in these districts. So it means that these people got an opportunity to move outside the city, and instead of being locked down in their flats, could move freer, had freer access, could walk around their country houses or in some other villas and cottages. We also see the rise in the number of people who had to stay at home during the lockdown. If we compare the map of image of the districts and this spatial behavior of the people during the pandemic, during the lockdown, we'll see that these spatial structures coincide. It means that social inequality has not only the social dimension, but also has a spatial dimension. And negative reputation, negative image of the district is related not only to the level of education of residents who are living there, but it is also related to the property owned by the residents. Certainly, it causes a lot of dissatisfaction. Next slide, please. Slide number 3. Thank you. This map reflects the social dissatisfaction. The more the population is anxious, the more people have certain phobias, the darker colors we have on the map. The survey, which was done by the Jubilatum and Urbanist Center in Moscow, showed that the districts populated by more anxious people discussed COVID-19 most often, and COVID-19 was always a top priority. And this was true of the suburban areas. But in the downtown of the city, the atmosphere was more calm. These 3 slides bring us to 2 conclusions, which has something to do with inequality. First of all, the reputational image of the district, which is not tangible very much, but it is very sustainable. And it becomes it turns out to be very difficult to change that reputation. And it is not just limited and reduced to building new buildings. So it means that in order to improve the living conditions, not only you have to support the vulnerable social strata and beautify the district, but you have to pursue certain information policy, awareness policy, and improve the image. Second conclusion is, despite the fact that when we look at how inequality is distributed about Moscow, and the map shows that very well, we see actually that the inequality rises from the downtown of the city to the suburban areas, and sometimes actually it overshadows the problems of the peripheral part. In the suburbs, you may find people who are more differentiated. And these are the suburbs of Moscow which need more attention. Do I have more time? Well, actually, a couple of minutes. Okay, we can continue our discussion. And we approach a very important thing, in the sense that the sources of inequality are changing, as it would necessitate the change in the policy, how to manage this issue. Before, during the Soviet times and even after the break-up of the Soviet Union, we spoke about the intelligentsia, districts populated by artists, by white-collar workers. Now we're speaking about the native inhabitants and the migrants. We are not speaking that this is a labor or an artists district, but we say that this is a migrants district. It means that the whole token of inequality has changed. Before, we spoke about deterioration of the material position. Means that in order to move from one district to another, you have to improve your social mobility and improve your education. Now, the inequality is showcased by migration, guest workers, working migrants, usually associated with the people of Central Asian origin. And it means that no longer you have to work in order to move to other country, but actually this problem is being extrapolated onto the migrant community, and this creates a problem of migrant minorities, national minorities, migrants associated with ethnicity, but at the same time they are associated with poverty, being very low in the social ladder. This is a very serious problem, not only for Moscow. For Moscow, this problem is not so pronounced due to the fact that until now we may enjoy the legacy of the Soviet past, when the most egalitarian city environment was created and when the social system with a single system of education, public transportation, and the social services sector was created, but still this problem is exacerbated every now and then. And next slide, please. It shows the districts populated by migrants. Although this is a quite outdated map, but still this is a map of the non-Russian population. And unfortunately, we cannot update that map as far as we do not have one single database, but the districts with the worst reputation, which is home to the people who have lots of fears, who are always anxious. These are the districts which have a very big community of migrants, and it causes a lot of controversies and disputes between the local inhabitants and migrants. COVID-19 also exacerbated this inequality, which does exist between the local citizens and migrants. I'm speaking about labor migrants and ethnic migrants of post-Soviet republics' origin. The difference in the living conditions between Muscovites and migrants is huge. Speaking about the share of people who have to live together in one room, in one flat, at least 3 people in one room or 3 people in one apartment, then this share among the Muscovites is 3 times less. So speaking about the incomes, sometimes migrants would earn more, but they have to work more. And the migrants are less protected in terms of the employer. COVID-19 again, migrants would lose their jobs twice as often compared to the Muscovites. Should Muscovites have, at least the residents of Moscow would have some cushion, financial cushion, migrants would not have any spare money. Solidarity among the migrants also was showcased. And usually, actually, we have a stereotype that migrant communities are very strong and that they support each other, unlike Muscovites, native citizens, but COVID-19 showed that this is not true. In such a critical emergency situation, Moscow residents and native residents, they supported each other, unlike the migrants. Thank you so much. I hope that we'll have an opportunity to discuss these questions more. I would like to turn to our international speakers, and then I doubt that we will get back to the toolkit, what we can do about these problems. I don't hope that our international speakers also would address the question of the indicators and how we may address inequality, how we measure inequality, and what factors are there, what factors impact inequality. I'm passing the floor to Graham Alabaster, UN Habitat Geneva Office Chief. Graham, are you with us? Are you tuned?
I am, yes. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you very much for the invite. Honour to be speaking to you all. I'm going to just share my screen here and attempt to give some sort of thoughts of UN Habitat's sort of take on this issue of inequality. I think perhaps the most important thing is, and I mean, it's been mentioned before, that COVID has indeed been something like an X-ray, and it's brought out these inequalities which already exist. I mean, as many of you know, the impact of the COVID crisis is going to have a huge impact, and it's reckoned that lots of people's living standards around the world are going to decrease by as much as almost a quarter, and it's going to be pushing us back in terms of attaining the SDGs. There's been nothing so serious as this since not even the Asian financial crisis in 1988. But of course, this inequalities that are showing up, that we've seen as a result of COVID, it's hit mainly the marginalized communities and those areas of cities that are poorly planned. They're neighborhoods where there's lack of services. And these people, because of the situation, are exposed to the disease, and they have a much worse outcome than those who live in greater income areas. In the developed economies, where the disease profile is much more related to non-communicable disease, there we see that the comorbidities of other factors like obesity, diabetes, and heart disease have also impacted. So we've seen this huge inequality existing. There are really many factors that we need to understand because, yes, spatial planning is one point, but there are many other things that we need to look at. We've heard from the previous professor that, of course, the spatial planning aspect is very right, but we also need to understand much more issues of density. And in fact, it's not actually density that we're worried about, but we're more worried about overcrowding. And by overcrowding, we mean, of course, lots of people living in close proximity in their housing, but also overcrowding with respect to access to basic services. You know, there are many, of course, other demographic factors that affect COVID and other such health issues and one of them is the issue of migrant workers, and that was the very clear evidence that's been coming out of the migrant communities, the workers in Malaysia and Singapore, has shown the incredibly high rates of spread of COVID-19 there. So these issues of age distribution and transportation are very important. If you look at these two countries, the way these different countries have impacted and what's happened with the COVID crisis, the fact that, you know, in Kenya, the population, the overall population of the country is much younger than a country like Italy, where we know had very serious outcomes of the disease. These factors also hugely we need to understand, and not only this demography, this is overlaid by the socioeconomic status as well. So it's actually quite a complex issue. So really, what do we need to do? Well, I think more than anything, this crisis has shown the amazing capacity that exists within cities and their communities to support national governments and particularly ministries of health to manage this crisis. You know, we've seen marvelous examples from cities around the world. They put in place local strategies to manage the outbreak. And that is very encouraging news. But of course, in many places, there's still a lot to do to untap that community spirit, that capacity within communities, and how cities and city managers can make the best of those resources. One of the issues, of course, that the COVID has shown up is that, yes, we can do things that, basically can address the immediate problem. There's something like a sticking plaster. They deal with the initial problem, but of course, the issue of sustainability is there. We may, in the short term, deal with some of these critical inequalities, but if we're not putting back we're not building back better for these communities, they will be a risk of going backwards again. And of course, they lose any opportunities for resilience in future pandemics. So really, we need to look much more at the long-term drivers of this urban inequity and what we can do. And of course, bearing in mind that many of the poorest in society, they don't just suffer from poor housing or poor water and sanitation or, insecure livelihoods. They often suffer from many things. So we really need to look at strengthening, social protection systems, along with improving the living conditions to ensure that, those disadvantages communities' needs are met. Looking much deeper and perhaps a bit more longer term at some of the sort of structural drivers of inequality, there's a lot to do around the issue of regulation in land and housing markets. And of course, the discrimination that comes with that in urban planning, investments and housing and infrastructure and services. So, we tend to concentrate the resources and efforts into the more wealthy areas of the city. But of course, if we don't plan and provide facilities in the poorer parts of the city, a disease like COVID and other future pandemics, of course, shows no boundaries. So, the whole city will suffer if we don't deal with those who are the most disadvantaged. So basically what, we need to do in terms of our recommendations, we need to address a lot of the discrimination that exists within urban settings. We need to look at those who are most in need. The only way we're going to do that is if we have better data. We saw the excellent maps of the city of Moscow. We need that sort of data from other cities around the world. We need to understand these inequities, these intra-urban differences, if we're to target which communities need our help the most. We do need to do what we can to enhance this self-resilience and build community capacity. There's been lots of work done on this track and trace systems. They rely very much on participation of communities. And we also need, in the longer term, to use these methods to feed back into our decision-making processes at city level. So I think I'll stop there. I've tried to be as brief as I can, but those are really the main elements of what we're trying to deal with and what we really need to address if we want a longer-term impact of urban planning and organising our urban cities more effectively. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Graham. I have a quick question to you. UN Habitat, does it put forward an objective to reduce inequality between urban and rural territories, as far as I know? In your opinion, what are the key mechanisms which can be engaged?
Absolutely, very critical question. Of course, UN Habitat works in human settlements of all sizes. So, whereas many people still seem to understand urban-rural as a black-white issue, it's actually not the case. Urban is a continuum from very low-density rural settlements to the most dense populated cities. It's incredibly important that we look much more closely at the relationships between bigger cities and their rural hinterlands, but also the relationship between cities of different sizes and conurbations, because nowadays, transportation, trade, migration between these different centres is critically important. So we can't exclude the rural centres. We have to look much more closely at the interaction between urban centres, the cities of all sizes, and their rural hinterlands.
Thank you so much. Saying that, I would like to pass the floor to our next speaker, David Napier. David, at several sessions today, we discussed the question of health in the cities. We know that Nordic, along with Strelka, are preparing a diabetes map. But also we speak a lot about the environmental friendliness. What criteria you are using in order to assess the health in the cities, and what the municipal authorities can do in order to improve the efficiency in that area in terms of health?
Hello, I'm David Napier. I'm the Global Academic Lead of Cities Changing Diabetes and Chairman. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I'm going to talk a bit about diabetes, obesity, and health vulnerability. Now, as a researcher, we all love numbers and we love data, but sometimes a comparison is a more powerful way of expressing a human need. Now, we all know that about a third of the world's population is currently obese or overweight, but to put it in graphic terms, if diabetes were a country, it would be the third largest country in the world with some 463 million inhabitants. This is why back in 2014, Novo Nordisk, the Steno Diabetes Center, and University College London joined together to start Cities Changing Diabetes. And those of you who were able to hear the talk by Novo Nordisk Vice President Niels Lund this afternoon will understand a bit more about the nature of that collaboration. Niels gave a really quite interesting talk about that. But what I want to do today is I want to focus on vulnerability specifically, and also on urban vulnerability. Now, suffice it to say that we all know that cities are complex, they're in flux, and they're often changing, meaning that diverse drivers can affect illness and its lived experience in society. What this means for us is that drivers are actually quite complex. They're heterogeneous. Risk factors are not like one another, and indeed they compound one another. So you can come up with a list such as we have here of diverse biological, social, geographical, cultural risk factors. And what you see immediately is, unlike in normal scientific research, in randomized control trials, for example, where we eliminate variables in order to understand relationships between, say, obesity and risk for diabetes. In the social world, in the lived world, in the real world, and in the urban world, these factors compound one another. And of course, you can draw lines across this any way you want between BMI, access to resources, distance to work and home, access to food, or peer appearance, how you look compared to other people. You can draw these lines up and down the columns, but the point is that it shows us that these factors are compounding, and that compounding nature needs to be understood because they also fuel one another. And it's the actual fueling of these risk factors that creates certain levels of vulnerability. Now, how do we know that the social compounds the biological, for example? I don't have time to talk about this in great detail, but let's just think about what's happening right now with COVID-19. Those of you who have heard Niels Lund's talk earlier today heard him emphasize the fact that health occurs largely outside of the health sector. Now, if we think about so-called diseases that are impacted by our lifestyle, like diabetes and obesity as it relates to food choices and exercise, put that in the context of COVID-19. A recent study by the University of North Carolina, funded by the World Bank, showed that death for COVID-19 was up 48% among obese populations in intensive care. And that literally 3 out of 4, 74% of all admissions to intensive care for COVID-19 involved complications of obesity. So you see here that the way we live and what we do actually connects across domains, making it not just a medical problem, but indeed quite a social one that's deeply impacted by the way we live and how we live. Now, in Cities Changing Diabetes, that's why we developed a vulnerability assessment, which looks at not only service utilization, which most real world data does as it relates to healthcare delivery, but also we dive down into communities to see how their structures, as we saw in the previous presentations, how community structures, levels of engagement and adaptation, what we oftentimes call social capital, has an impact on the way in which people respond in the presence or absence of certain service utilization services that people can take advantage of. But we do one other thing. We try to drill down and understand vulnerability. And in fact, you can take that vulnerability assessment and you can transform it into this image, which we call the vulnerability vortex, which shows that once you get below the vulnerability threshold, where you're really involved in calamity coping, and you're actually basing all of your activities on survival needs, you really lose your capability, your opportunity, and your motivation. And this is something that's been brought out really quite in a fascinating way by the work by our Moscow team colleagues in Cities Changing Diabetes, a great team of field workers and digital ethnographers who are showing how, in the absence of people being able to meet face-to-face, we really do depend upon these communication techniques. And often the most vulnerable people are left out of that picture because they don't have access to those resources, or they're so engaged in the basic survival needs that COVID-19 or diabetes or obesity may be 8th or 9th and 10th on their list of concerns, if indeed it's on there at all. And this is because those people are engaged in simply what we call calamity coping, as we found out in our study of homelessness in London, where in times of crisis, when inequalities tend to be exaggerated, as you can see here, the number of homeless is up a third on last year in the context of coronavirus. African Americans in the United States, 30% of them know someone who's died of COVID-19, 31%, whereas less than 10%, 9% of white Americans do. The point being here that at all levels, when these exaggerations take place, people do descend into being incapable of actually engaging in all of those behavior change programs that we'd like them to. And what this means is that we need to understand that vulnerability happens across the spectrum. Any one of us can become vulnerable. Even a wealthy person in Park Avenue now living in an apartment where you can't open windows is probably more vulnerable to COVID-19 than an elderly person living in suburbia alone and with being able to socially distance. So the take-home message about vulnerability, to put it simply, is this: to understand it, you have to go out and find it, because it's unlikely to represent itself if it's too preoccupied with basic survival and calamity coping. We could say a lot more about that, but there's another take-home message here as it relates to the relationship between health being constructed outside of the health sector and what other sectors need to be involved. And that's the importance of the Health in All Policies framework, where more than ever, we need to understand the health impacts of housing, water, and sanitation, transportation, occupational factors, in addition to physical activity, food production, and so forth that relate specifically to diabetes and obesity. We spent a lot of time talking about this. It's been around since the 2006 presidency of the European Union by the Finnish contingency, and it's something that we really need to take a whole lot more seriously as a take-home message from COVID-19 and its relationship to diabetes and obesity. Now, how have we acted on this in Cities Changing Diabetes? Just a final comment. I'll give you two examples that are different than the one Niels Lund gave this afternoon. One is our colleagues in Italy, under the directorship of Professor Andrea Lenzi at Sapienza University, have developed a Health City Manager program. The goal of this program is to institute in cities across Italy a healthy city manager whose job it actually is to understand what we know and don't know about health and all policies in each of those cities, and how people across sectors are working, what they know, what they don't know, and what they need to know. And this actually has developed into a formal curriculum, which is being rolled out as I speak across Italy. A second quick example, and a very different one, comes from our Mexican colleagues. Here you see our colleague Simon Baikera Barquera, who directs the nutrition center at the National Institute for Public Health in Cuernavaca. And their work has shown and had a strong impact on creating new policies across Mexico. Here we see on the left of my screen, you see over 2 years running now, the soda tax has resulted in a decrease in soda utilization. And what's even more interesting on a positive note, and that's the graph the bar that's going up, it's resulted in an increase in water use. A real success story that we think needs to be celebrated, and one that we're very proud to see happening through one of our colleagues in the program. So all in all, I just want to say that it's a great pleasure and an honor to be involved in Cities Changing Diabetes with our now 36 cities and growing. And I look forward to working with my colleagues across the world well into the future. Thank you very much.
David, спасибо вам большое.
David, thank you so much for a very interesting report. Really, the diabetes problem is one of the most crucial, one of the most
Проблем, которые вне зависимости от ковида стоят
relevant, which every country is facing despite COVID-19,
поскольку
as far as
все больше захватывает разные, причем слои населения.
diabetes doesn't spare anyone.
Ваши исследования
All the
более эффективны.
layers of the population are vulnerable to that disease, and without that, your studies will help us to cope with that disease. Saying that, I would like to pass the floor to our next speaker, Guillermo Penalosa. Apologize, it is evening already. I may mispronounce your name. Gil is known as a person who develops city parks, city spaces. One of the outstanding cases is setting up a park in Bogota, which brought together two parts of the city, connected two parts of the city,
социального неравенства.
and this was a bridge, bridging the gap of inequalities. So tell us how, by means of such projects, we may address the inequality problem.
We don't hear you. Gil, we don't hear you. Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yes?
Okay, thank you.
you.
Half of the homes that will be around in 40 years, half around the world, do not or it's not is the slides are not moving.
Так.
Hello?
Hello. Извините, у нас маленькие технические.
Apologize, we have a technical glitch.
Okay, now.
Ага, вот, теперь все заработало. What's
Half of the homes that will be around in 40 years in the world do not exist today. Do not exist today. Today we have about 3.5 billion people living in cities, in urban areas. Within the lifetime of our children, of our students, it's going to double to 7 billion. And it could be, we need to decide how do we want to live, because it could be very civilized, where people walk and ride bicycles and use public transit, and people can enjoy nature and each other. So we have a fantastic opportunity, but more than an opportunity, a responsibility, because whatever we do or don't do in the next 40 years is how billions of people are going to live for hundreds of years. So if this is going to happen in the next 40, we can see what has happened in the last 40. Because if what we've been doing is good, let's just do more of the same. Unfortunately, in the last 40, this is how we've been doing cities, segregating people, sending the poor people to the worst places where there is no mobility and no jobs and bad quality of housing. Even in the wealthiest country, in the US, here we see cities by life expectancy. We see that in the same city by postal code, if you are born in one neighborhood, your life expectancy might be 60. If you are born 10 minutes away, your life expectancy might be 90. It's horrible. In the last 40 years, we've been focusing on car, and not on people's happiness. And this is how we've been doing the cities to solve mobility. Billions invested, and we haven't even solved mobility doing all of these investments. So we need to improve the cities that we have today, but we also need to create great cities for many, many millions of people. We must create cities radically different. We must manage cities radically different. It doesn't matter if the city is 2,000 people or 500,000 or 5 million or more, the issues are the same. We need public transit in all of them. It's a different public transit in each one. And we are dealing with all of these issues, and we were working on climate change, and we see the symptoms everywhere when all of a sudden COVID-19 arrived. And some people say that COVID-19 arrived and all changed. I think more than all changed, I think that the perception changed. All of a sudden, it was like if we had some magnifying glasses, that we were able to see things that were in front of our nose, but we were not paying attention. For example, equity. Now we see people sleeping on parking lots to be physically separated when 90% of the hotel rooms are empty. But on the positive side, with fewer cars, we saw how we have cleaner air. So are we going to go back to this horrible quality of air, or are we going to take advantage of a new, better future? I think the post-COVID, we need to focus on health, on equity, on sustainability. We need to have clear, how do we want to live? How do you want cities in Russia to become? And I think the goal is that people must live healthier and happier, and cities must be equitable and sustainable. We should evaluate cities. It's by how do we treat the most vulnerable citizens? How do we treat the most vulnerable? Who are the most vulnerable? By age, the children and the elderly, but also everyone that is poor, everyone that has disabilities, people from racial minorities, from ethnic minorities, in many countries, women. So these are our most vulnerable. So this is what we should be paying attention to in the recovery on the post-COVID. As an example, children and older adults. Children, we should have in Russian cities playability everywhere, on the sidewalks, on the parks, on the streets, waiting for the bus stop. And some people might say, why is it that play is so important? Yes, it's fun and games, but it's also how children learn. Playing is how children develop their muscle strength, their sociability, their language, their friendship, the sense of belonging, the cognitive thinking. And not only children, older adults. We are living longer, much, much longer. And people are enjoying gardening and having ice cream and playing with the grandchildren. The population over 60 is going to double. The population over 80 is going to quadruple. We should have a movement of citizens alive to tell people we are alive. Older people can live healthier and can live happier. Older people are givers, they are not takers. In Russia, the life expectancy doubled in the last 150 years. I mean, people have been around for 200,000 years. And up until 200 years ago, there was not a single country with a life expectancy above 45. Today, there is no country in the world with a life expectancy below 45. We learn to survive. But when we start all of these issues of climate change and public health and congestion, we need to learn how to live. So we need to plan cities differently. We need to change. Why don't we change? Because change is hard. Doing more of the same is easy. But we know that the cities we've been building are not sustainable environmentally, financially, not good for health. So we need to change. 3 recommendations. Change is not unanimous. Second, the general interest must prevail over the particular interest. And third, the cost of doing nothing is not nothing. So we need to change. And these are not technical issues. We know what needs to be done. These are not financial. We have the money, but we're investing it in the wrong places. It's more about policy, but not of political parties. We need it with a big P. Everybody needs to participate. We need to be bold and be ambitious with the goals. We need to develop alliances with the school and the faith groups and the university, the public sector, the private sector, the not-for-profit. We need to develop a sense of urgency. And one more urgency than COVID-19. But maybe this crisis will provide an opportunity. With fewer cars, we've seen how many cities are building bicycle corridors, interconnecting, something that would have taken years in other time. Now they're doing it in weeks. We need spaces to be around that physically separated. Now people are taking over streets. If we look at cities from the air, between 25 and 35% are streets. The streets are the biggest public space. So they can have different uses, as in Auckland, New Zealand, or Oakland, California. And we are doing bus lanes all over the place and using streets. The street is public for markets. And we are also seeing how golf courses have been turned into public parks. So instead of having golf courses in the city where 200 people can play, we have public parks where thousands of people play. The businesses are reinventing themselves. So the impossible all of a sudden seems possible. But there is so much more that we need to do. We need to develop a shared vision. Like, for example, in New York, people say, oh, the Blacks and the Hispanics are getting affected by COVID. No, it's not the Blacks and the Hispanics. It's the poor Blacks and the poor Hispanics. The wealthy Blacks and the wealthy Hispanics are working from home. They are not getting infected. It's the low-income people where 90% of the people have to work away from home, have to be with others. So we need to develop a shared vision of the cities that we want. But vision is not enough. We need action, action, action. And if we have a shared vision and lots of action, we are going to be able to create cities that are more equitable and more sustainable, where all people are going to be able to live healthier and happier. So I invite everyone, listen and let's do it. But we need to do it now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gil. And to finish our session, I'd like to give 1 minute to every speaker so that we can answer one question very briefly. What we have to do in order to minimize inequality in the cities? We know that we cannot just eradicate that problem, but probably something to alleviate inequality. Well, in 1 minute, I do think that the mechanism is very well known. This is about civil society solidarity, support of the policy which works for the sake of that solidarity. The problem is that the modern life drives us away from that solution, because the mobility, instead of bringing people together, would disintegrate them, drive them apart. New technologies also work not only for the sake of solidarity, but for disintegration. Migration flows also undermine local communities. What is left? We have to find the right balance between the possibility to live in the modern society using modern technologies, but at the same time, we have to use the centuries-long skills of cohabitation, coexistence, and solidarity and mutual support. Thank you so much, Olga. Graham? Just 1 minute to answer that question. What do I have to do in order to bridge this gap?
I think for me, there's a greater need for more disaggregated urban data to understand exactly these inequities and where they exist, to understand from all backgrounds, aside from socioeconomic data, also the living condition of people, the quality of their housing, the quality of the access to services, how they behave when they need to seek treatment when they're sick. All of these issues need to be collected together so we can understand some of these complex mix of determinants that governs people's health. Once we've got that data, then we can empower cities to do a lot more, to work more closely, with communities, to untap the capacity in communities, not only to monitor and track what's going on and to give feedback, but also to be involved in the decision-making and the investment decisions that the city needs. We're only going to be as good as a city, the best we can be, if we take care of the poorest and the most vulnerable within our cities. And that's really what we have to focus on. Thank you.
Спасибо большое, Дэвид.
Thank you so much, David. Over to you. Bearing in mind the features of your work, how do we provide for the best access to medical healthcare?
Yes, thank you very much. I believe that we really need to focus, as the previous speaker said, on understanding vulnerability. And to do that, we need not to look at an evidence base, we need to go out and find an evidence base, because most of these complex risk factors and this case definitions of vulnerability that they create need to be characterized. And once they're characterized, we can scale up this lived experience to the level of evidence. We can understand what it is that keeps people from not being able to cross over from being engaged in complete calamity coping to being advocates and agents of their own health destiny. And we need to understand how cooperation across sectors is absolutely critical. I think that taking COVID-19 as a learning lesson means it's not just a matter of just recovery, it's a matter of just preparedness for the next event that inevitably humans will face at some point in the future. Thank you very much.
Большое спасибо, Гил. И
Thank you so much. Gil, just 1 minute to you.
вам с тем же самым вопросом.
The same question.
I think the issue of equity is not a technical issue. We know the solutions. We know they exist. It's not a financial issue. The money is there, but we're putting it to build highways. For example, we know that there is no city in the world that has solved mobility through the private car. None. Nevertheless, cities continue to invest billions and billions in highways. You go to Nairobi in Kenya, where only 13% of the people have cars, and they're investing billions to put a highway through the middle of the city. When there are no sidewalks, no protected bikeways, the public transit is bad. So this is not technical, this is not financial, this is political. We need to have the politicians develop alliances between the public sector and the private sector and the NGOs, and really to make equity a priority. We know that everybody needs to have a park within walking distance, because then people are going to be healthier and happier, but many people do not. We know that people need to walk or bike. People need to be physically active. So I think we have more than enough data. We have more than enough examples to act. But the key issue is to act. And we need to take advantage of democracy. Elections matter. And we need to put a lot of pressure, because there is a clear sense of urgency. And finally, we have done a lot of good things. When I was born, more than 60% of the people in the world lived in extreme poverty. In only my lifetime, it has gone from 60% to less than 10%. So we have done some good things. But of course, we need to do much, much more. Not technical, not financial, it's political.
Гил, спасибо большое.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Gil. I would like to thank all our speakers for very interesting discussion. I'd like once again to bring us back to the development section, because we spoke about inequality from different viewpoints, but this is about economic inequality as well. Let's hope that the comprehensive development of territories projects will step by step address that problem, because the jobs matter and the quality of jobs matter. Because as we saw, most vulnerable districts are the industrial ones, where the gravest situations occur, and people are very anxious about COVID, and these districts are not most favorable. So let's hope that all the plans, all these tracks would come true and would result in more sustainability and flourishing of our cities. Thank you so much once again. We call it a day. Thank you so much.